web is populated with many great educational resources that allow you and your students to access and share information, collaborate with others, and create in ways not possible before its advent. DPS realizes that today's 21st century classrooms must use the internet in order to achieve the district's academic goals for its students. This video was created to inform you on how to use the web legally and ethically with your students. It covers 3 areas. The first being Durham Public Schools Acceptable Use Policies. The second being Children's Internet Protection Act, known as CIPA, and web filtering. And the third and final is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, known as COPPA, and Website Operators' Terms of Service. Durham Public Schools Acceptable Use Policy. Board Policy 3040 outlines what is deemed to be acceptable use of technology within Durham Public Schools. Students are given the privilege to use the internet along with the responsibility of using it properly. Students are responsible for exhibiting high standards of behavior in using the school system's technological resources, as set forth in Board Policy 4301, referring to the Code of Student Conduct. No signature is required for students to use the district's technological resources. However, they must comply fully with the Code of Student Conduct in order to maintain their access privileges. What is acceptable, responsible, efficient, legal activities that support teaching and learning? Staff members will instruct students in the correct use of these resources, as outlined in Board Policy 3015, referring to the selection and reconsideration of resources, and ensure that students read and understand the guidelines established by the district. However, the ultimate responsibility for a student's actions in using the technological resources rests with the student. Using the Information and Technology Essential Standards, students will be taught safe, ethical, and responsible uses of technological resources. Students who fail to adhere to the requirements of this policy could face disciplinary action, which may include immediate revocation of user privileges, suspension of access to school system computers, dismissal and/or appropriate legal action. CIPA, the Children's Internet Protection Act, requires public schools that receive federal E-rate funds to implement a web filter to protect minors from visual depictions that are obscene, child pornographic, or otherwise harmful. CIPA also requires schools to adopt and enforce a policy to monitor online activities of minors. Consequently, Durham Public Schools employs a web filter to protect students from harmful content and potentially dangerous communication. It's important to know that DPS staff has a greater level of access to the web within the district than students do. In order for staff to receive this greater level of access, they must make sure that they are authenticated to the network. In other words, the network needs to recognize who you are. If, as a staff member, you are blocked from a website that you know you should have access to, enter your DPS username and password into the fields, and you will be authenticated. In addition to harmful and obscene websites, a few other categories of websites are blocked due to their violation of DPS Acceptable Use Policy. For example, hacking sites are blocked by the web filter because hacking is prohibited by the DPS Acceptable Use Policies for both staff and students. The DPS Educational Technology team has created a rubric for judging a website's appropriate accessibility in the light of CIPA and DPS Acceptable Use Policies. Go to edtech.dpsnc.net for more details. If you or your students need access to a resource on the web that is denied, but according to the rubric is appropriate, you may contact your school's technology facilitator or your school's educational technology rep to unblock the site for you. COPPA and Terms of Service. Before using any resource on the web, it's very important to be aware of the applicable laws and terms of service. Anyone who's signed up for an online service is familiar with the seemingly never-ending user agreement that has to be agreed to before receiving access. For those of us without a law degree, some of the language can be challenging to understand. However, there are some really important details in those agreements, especially for those of us who teach or have children under 13 years of age. Web service providers must comply with a federal law titled the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA. COPPA, in short, requires web service operators to receive verifiable parental consent before collecting any personal information from children 12 or under. Personal information could include items like their name, their location, or even their school. Consequently, many mainstream providers like Google or Facebook, etc., deny access to users under 13 because they cannot or don't want to go through the hassle of obtaining that verifiable parental consent that COPPA requires. If you teach children affected by COPPA, how do you comply with the law and still use some of the wonderful services on the web for teaching and learning? Well, 1. Be mindful of COPPA each time you want to use a web service with your students. 2. Only use a service with your 12 and under students using the following 3 options. Option 1. Use the service if it does not require the 12 and under students to create accounts. For example, you can create a Google Docs document, text, spreadsheet, etc., and publish it on the web, which allows anyone with a link to edit it. No logging in is needed. Your students do not need an account. They are not providing Google with any personal information and are complying with COPPA. Obviously, it's still important to talk to your students about what information is appropriate and safe to put on the web. There are several websites dedicated to helping educators teach their students about online safety. A couple suggested websites to use are NetSmarts, created by the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and Common Sense Media. Option 2. Use the service if your students, according to the service's terms of service, can create accounts with parental permission, and you as the teacher have collected that permission form. Many sites like Edmodo, which are intended for the K-12 environment, allow access to users under 13 as long as the teacher or the school collects those parental permission forms. If you are using a service like Edmodo, make sure you collect those parental permission forms and keep them on file. An efficient way of doing this is by listing all of the COPPA compliant websites that you want to use in your class during the year and put them into one permission form. Tell your parents explicitly what the site is, its rules, and what you expect your students to be doing or learning on the site. Option 3. Use a service if your school has assumed the responsibility for complying with COPPA. For example, Google Apps for Education, not to be confused with the widely available Google accounts, allows the district or school to assume the responsibility for collecting those all-important verifiable parental consent forms. The district agrees to comply with COPPA by collecting those forms, maybe even with your help. And then Google will agree to provide the service. Each web service has its own unique terms of service, so it's important not to just blindly click agree when you sign up for a new one. Understand what the terms of service say and make sure that you are in full compliance when using it with your students.